The night had been heavy with silence. From the bunkers on Betio, only the faint hiss of the tide against coral reached the ears of Sergeant Nakamura. He sat behind his Type 92 machine gun, staring into darkness, broken only by the pale edge of reef glistening under the moon. He had memorized the orders. The rift of coral lying 600 yards from the beach was their shield. Boats would stick there, trapped in shallow water. Men would have to wade chest-deep across the lagoon under his fire. The rifles were sighted, the mortars aligned. He imagined them already drowning in blood before they touched the sand. When dawn crept over the horizon, he saw the gray line of American transports far out at sea. Then, movement in the water. Higgins' boats, small silhouettes, cutting toward the reef. Nakamura felt grim satisfaction. The sea would halt them. He shouted to his men, and the guns readied. Minutes later, his vision sharpened. Some of the boats slowed, halted, stranded in the shallows. He watched figures leap into the water, men dragging themselves forward, packs heavy, rifles held overhead. Perfect targets. His finger tightened on the trigger. The reef had done its work. But then he saw something else. Dark shapes rising from the surf behind the first wave. Not boats, not tanks. Something in between. The machines churned forward, water spilling from their tracks, crawling across the reef as if the ocean floor itself obeyed them. Steel hulls rode over coral, treads grinding against stone. They looked like armored beasts, half ship, half monster, dragging themselves out of the sea. Nakamura froze. This was not in the plans. This was not in the diagram studied in the bunker. The Americans were supposed to break on the reef, not ride over it. He watched, horrified, as one of the machines reared onto the sand, its bow dropping like a jaw. Marines poured out, rifles ready, charging straight for his line. Bullets rattled against the steel sides of the monster, sparks flashing, but it did not stop. It kept crawling, throwing up sand, unstoppable. For the first time, Nakamura felt fear not of the men, but of the machine itself, an iron creature born of water, devouring distance. The reef had betrayed them. The sea no longer defended Japan. Sometimes the deadliest weapon in war is not the one you prepare for, but the one you never believed could exist. Long before Tarawa, before Marines stormed across reefs, there had been only an idea scribbled in Florida. Donald Roebling was not a soldier. He was an inventor with a famous name. His grandfather had built the Brooklyn Bridge. Donald wanted something else, a rescue craft for hurricane zones, a machine that could plow through swamps and flooded streets to save the stranded. In 1935, he watched newsreels of Florida towns flattened by storms, families trapped on rooftops, supplies rotting on docks. He asked himself, what if a vehicle could ignore water and mud alike? He sketched broad tracks shaped like paddles, a hull light enough to float, an engine strong enough to push it forward whether on land or sea. He called it the Alligator. The first prototype looked ungainly, almost comical, a steel box on wide tracks, lumbering across marsh. But when he drove it straight into the water and it swam forward, people gasped. It was not graceful, but it moved. Where boats grounded, it crawled. Where trucks bogged, it surged. A machine that ignored the line between land and sea. The Marines saw potential. In the late 1930s, officers visited Roebling's workshop. They were polite, curious, asking if his Hurricane tractor could carry men, guns, supplies. Roebling shrugged. He had never thought of war. But the Corps thought of the Pacific. They saw lagoons, reefs, and beaches ringed with guns. They saw a machine that might bridge the unbridgeable. In 1940, the Navy ordered modifications. Armor plating replaced aluminum skins. A ramp was added. Weapons mounts appeared. The Alligator shed its civilian skin and grew claws. It became the LVT, landing vehicle, tracked. What had been built to save lives was reshaped to take them. Roebling later admitted he was uneasy. He had wanted his invention to pull survivors from floodwaters. Now it would deliver Marines into machine gun fire. He once said, "It was never meant for killing, but war has its own appetite." His words captured the irony perfectly. By 1942, factories across America stamped out hundreds of LVTs. Their forms multiplied, some simple troop carriers, others with turrets and guns. Each one carried the DNA of Roebling's vision, but twisted by necessity. And so the monster was born not in a weapons lab, but in a rescue sketchbook. A machine meant to save hurricane victims would crawl across Pacific reefs, shrugging off coral and sand, carrying men into history. Sometimes war reshapes mercy into menace, and sometimes the sharpest weapon begins as a lifeline. The lagoon was boiling with smoke and spray. Corporal James Donnelly gripped the control levers of his LVT-2, sweat running into his eyes despite the salt wind. The roar of naval bombardment behind him shook his chest, but ahead, the reef stretched like a jagged scar across the lagoon. He knew what waited there, Japanese guns, pre-sighted on the shallows. He had watched Higgins' boats struggle. Their flat bottoms slammed against the coral ridge and stuck fast, some 500 yards short of the beach. Marines clambered over the sides, stumbling into chest-high water, bullets snapping into spray around them. Donnelly clenched his jaw. If we had come in one of those, we'd already be dead. He jammed the throttle. The Amtrak surged forward, its wide tracks slapping water like giant paddles. The bow lifted as it hit the reef. For a moment the machine groaned, rocking against coral teeth. Donnelly's hands tightened on the levers. Then the tracks bit, clawing over stone. The vehicle crawled forward, half boat, half tank, dragging itself up and across. Shells burst ahead, fountains of spray hammering the lagoon. His gunner fired short bursts from the mounted 50, empty casings bouncing against the steel hull. Inside, Marines hunched with rifles between their knees, staring through the open hatch. Donnelly heard one of them mutter a prayer. Then the bow dropped. They were over. Sand hissed beneath the tracks as the Amtrak slid down the inner slope of the reef. Donnelly saw the beach rising before him, already torn by explosions. Palm trunks lay shattered, bunkers spitting fire, but his vehicle kept moving, claws biting into sand where no boat could go. He slammed through the surf line, water crashing against the hull, and rammed the LVT up onto the beach. The ramp clanged down. Marines leapt out, running low, rifles ready. Donnelly spun the tracks, reversing back into the lagoon for another run. Behind him he glimpsed Higgins' boats, still stranded, men waiting, many falling. His stomach twisted. The difference was brutal arithmetic. Those who rode in Amtraks had a chance. Those left on the reef were targets. Later, survivors would remember that the first waves of LVTs were the only reason Betio fell at all. They carried men through water too shallow for boats and too deep for walking. They crawled over coral the enemy thought impassable. They became the spearhead of the landing, iron monsters rising from the sea. That day, Donnelly made 4 trips. He ferried Marines, hauled ammo, carried wounded out under fire. By the time his LVT was hit and disabled, the beachhead was already dug in. He never forgot the sight of Higgins' boat stranded behind him, nor the way his Amtrak had clawed forward when everything else stopped. He once told a reporter, "It was like the ocean itself had given us legs." For the Japanese on Betio, it was the moment prophecy failed. The reef did not save them. The sea itself betrayed them, crawling ashore on steel tracks. Sometimes a battle turns not on courage alone, but on the machine that makes the impossible path real. The engine never really slept. Even at idle, it throbbed behind my back, a steady hammering that made the floor plates quiver under my boots. Sitting in the driver's seat of an LVT meant you lived with that noise. It wasn't a sound anymore, it was a second heartbeat. Every shudder of the transmission, every cough of the exhaust, spoke to me like a language. If the pitch changed, I knew something was wrong before any gauge told me. The machine was unlike anything else we had. Boats floated, trucks rolled, tanks clattered, but this thing This alligator-turned-monster was something in between. I sat surrounded by steel plates bolted together like armor on a knight, but under me the tracks were not for roads, not for mud alone. They were shaped like paddles, broad cleats cut with deep ridges, each step into water scooped and shoved like a hand dragging the ocean backward. The first time I drove one into the surf, I thought it would sink. The nose dipped, water rushed up the sides, and the hull rocked in a way no tank should. My stomach clenched. Then the tracks bit into the water, and we moved. Not fast, 5 knots on a good day, but steady, claws raking the sea. The bow rose and fell like a living thing, groaning each time it found resistance, but it pushed on. On land, the feeling changed. The same tracks that churned water pressed wide against sand. A Higgins boat would bury its flat belly, stuck on the first dune. A tank would sink nose first until its tracks spun helplessly. But the Amtrak spread its weight like a sand crab. The cleats dug shallow, biting into grains without sinking. We called it walking the beach, and when you felt it, you understood. The machine was born for thresholds, water to sand, sand to reef, reef to jungle. Inside it was chaos. The heat wrapped around you, thick as wool. Fumes crawled up your throat, leaving the taste of gasoline on your tongue. The steering levers jerked against your palms, heavy cables pulling the tracks left and right with the stubbornness of oxen. Every correction was a fight. Sweat dripped into your eyes, stinging. You couldn't hear men shouting in the cargo hold behind you unless they banged on the hull. But you kept your eyes forward, your hands tight. The Amtrak didn't forgive mistakes. I learned quickly that water was not always a friend. Salt chewed at the gears, corroded wires, rotted everything it touched. A careless landing could tear a sprocket clean off, leaving us wallowing like a dead whale in the surf. More than once I had to climb into oily water up to my chest, wrench in hand, to replace a track shoe while mortar shells whistled overhead. We joked that LVT didn't mean landing vehicle tracked. It meant let's volunteer trouble. But we also knew the truth. Without them, we would never have reached those beaches alive. The Japanese had built their defense on arithmetic. They calculated the tide, the reef, the depth. They knew a boat could not cross and a man could not run fast enough. What they never factored was a vehicle that could ignore both equations. Our tracks pressed onto coral with a weight spread so wide it barely cracked the stone. We crawled where ships stopped. The mechanics were simple enough on paper. A gasoline engine sat in the rear, driving sprockets that turned the endless belts of steel links. Each link carried a cleat like a shovel blade, scooping when in water, gripping when on sand. The suspension groaned under stress, but it flexed enough to ride over rocks or stumps. To us inside, it felt like being in the stomach of some great beast, every clang of track against hull like its bones creaking. But what mattered was not the diagrams. It was what happened when the ramp dropped and the men inside leapt into gunfire with dry rifles. A Higgins boat could carry them close but not over the reef. A tank could smash bunkers but not swim. Only the Amtrak bridged the gap. I watched it again and again. Marines crouched behind the thin sides, eyes wide, then the beach slamming under our tracks and the ramp falling. The relief on their faces told me more than any manual could. We tried every trick to keep them alive. Armor was thin, so thin a rifle round could sometimes punch through if it hit square. We welded extra plates, bolted on sandbags, even strapped spare track links along the sides. Some gunners joked that we looked like turtles carrying our shells patched with junk. But the extra weight didn't matter when the alternative was a hole through the driver's chest. I still remember one landing where we hit the reef at full speed and a Japanese shell found us. It slammed into the side but didn't explode, a dud. It punched a fist-sized dent into the plate and jammed itself there, sizzling hot. We kept moving, water spraying over the bow. Later, when we hauled the machine ashore, we pried the shell out and kept it as a trophy. Someone scratched into it. Even monsters get lucky. From the outside, they looked slow, awkward, ugly. From the inside, they felt like desperation given tracks. Every creak, every leak, every patch job done under fire was proof that they weren't perfect machines. But perfection wasn't the point. The point was simple. They moved when nothing else could. The numbers tell their own story. A standard LVT-2 could carry 20 Marines with gear or 2 tons of supplies. It burned fuel like a thirsty giant, 1 gallon every half mile, but it was worth it. By 1944, thousands rolled off assembly lines, each one a lifeline across a killing zone. By Okinawa, more than 1,000 stormed the beaches in the first waves, a tide of steel-backed beasts. Arithmetic didn't lie. Everyone that crawled ashore saved dozens of men from drowning in reefs and machine gun fire. I used to imagine how we must have looked to the enemy. From their bunkers, they saw shapes rising out of the sea where no ship should float, crawling forward like creatures from a nightmare. Gunfire sparked against their sides, smoke poured from their exhausts, and still they came, dropping jaws of steel to vomit men with rifles. The reef had been their ally. We turned it into our road. One night after Tarawa, I sat on a crate, hands black with grease, staring at my LVT parked in the shadows. Its sides were dented, scarred with bullet strikes, paint blistered from fire. It stank of fuel and salt. But to me it looked alive, like a beast resting after a hunt. I thought of Donald Roebling and his hurricane rescue machine. Did he ever imagine this? Did he know his child would become a monster of war? I tightened the last bolt, wiped my hands, and leaned against the hull. The steel was warm still, as if it breathed. I whispered, "You ugly bastard, you saved them today." Sometimes victory does not come from elegance. It comes from the brute stubbornness of a machine that refuses to stop, one claw after another, dragging itself out of the sea. The ocean was alive with fire that morning. From horizon to horizon, ships spat flame into the sky, their shells arching like angry comets. The beach of Saipan lay ahead, hidden behind smoke that rose in thick black curtains. Waves rolled beneath our tracks, but the water was red with reflection. I sat behind the breech of a 75mm howitzer, bolted inside the turret of an LVT-A4. To some, we were amphibious tractors. To us, we were artillery that swam. The engine's growl filled the compartment, mixing with the stink of gasoline and cordite. Salt water sloshed under my boots. My gunner's hand rested on the elevation wheel, steady as stone. The order came through the headset. Advance with first wave, suppress beach emplacements. Simple words. But the weight was immense. We were not to land like infantry. We were to fire while still afloat, clawing forward through surf, laying shells into bunkers before the first rifleman touched sand. The driver pushed throttle. Our tracks churned water like twin mill wheels. Spray lashed against the bow, but the am-tank crawled forward, nose dipping and rising, always hungry. The turret swayed. Through the sight, I caught glimpses of palm trunks, sand mounds, concrete dots, pillboxes carved into the shoreline. "Target! Left bunker!" My voice cracked. The gunner swung the turret, lined the crosshair. The loader rammed a shell into the breech. Metal slammed, echoing like a church bell. "Fire!" The gun kicked. The hull shook. Smoke filled the turret. Out the slit I saw the shell burst, throwing sand and timber into the air. The wave rocked us, nearly throwing me against the steel wall. But the driver corrected, keeping us pointed toward the enemy. Behind us, dozens of other LVT-A4s crawled in line, each spitting shells across the lagoon. It was a sight I will never forget. An armored tide, each machine, both boat and tank, laying fire as it swam. No fleet in history had looked like that before. The Japanese had prepared their guns for infantry, for Higgins boats grinding to a halt, for men wading chest deep. They had not prepared for floating artillery. Their fire stuttered, wild. Tracer lines danced above the surf, but we were already close. "Second round, same target," I barked. Another shell slammed into the breech, the recoil hammering the turret. Sand geysered. The bunker fell silent. Marines cheered behind us, though their voices were drowned by engines. At that moment I realized the paradox of our machine. It was ungainly, slow, thirsty for fuel, but it was also unstoppable. On land, it clawed. At sea, it swam. With a gun strapped to its back, it became something else entirely, a monster that could shoot while crossing the one place the enemy thought safe, the water. The advance felt endless. Surf pounded, smoke blinded. My ears rang from every blast, but we pressed on. Each round fired made the landing less lethal for the men following in Higgins' boats. That was the cruel equation. Every minute we survived afloat meant fewer Marines cut down in the surf. A shell struck near our bow. Water exploded in a white column, drenching us, slamming the hull sideways. My teeth rattled. The driver swore, dragging the machine back on course. My loader coughed, hands slick with sweat and smoke. Still, we fired. By the time our tracks crunched onto sand, my arms were numb from bracing. The turret stank of gunpowder. We had burned through half our ammo. But the beachhead was alive with Marines pouring ashore. Behind them, our sister vehicles wheeled inland, still firing, claws biting into black volcanic soil. Later reports said Saipan cost us dearly. Thousands dead, thousands more wounded. But in those first hours, the Amtraks had done their work. They had crossed the reef, spat fire on the bunkers, and given the infantry a fighting chance. I never forgot the look on one Marine's face as he sprinted past our turret, eyes wide, jaw clenched. He glanced at our vehicle, still dripping from the surf, gun smoking, and nodded. Just once. That nod meant everything. He knew we had carried fire across the sea for him. After the battle, I walked the beach. Bunkers lay torn, their embrasures black with soot. Dead palm trees jutted like broken spears. In the surf, wrecked Higgins boats bobbed, their crews gone. Among them, our LVTA-4s still floated, scarred but afloat, waiting for repair or burial. Historians later wrote of the day, counting tonnage, casualties, acreage gained. But for us, it was simpler. We had been artillery that swam. We had turned the ocean into a firing line. Sometimes the revolution in war is not seen in new rifles or faster planes. Sometimes it comes when a clumsy-looking tractor grows claws, swims like a beast, and brings its gun to the very edge of the enemy's sand. The command post smelled of kerosene and damp earth. Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata leaned over the map table, the lines of Tinian etched in blue and red. His officers clustered close, their uniforms soaked with sweat in the humid cave. He jabbed a finger at the northern coast. "Here," he said, "white beaches, narrow, rocky, blocked by coral. They are useless. The Americans will never risk an assault here." The men nodded. The logic was sound. The beaches were only a few dozen yards wide at low tide, flanked by coral shelves sharp as blades. Inland, cliffs rose abruptly. Artillery had little arc there. Defenders would be cramped, fields of fire limited. Any landing attempt would be madness. Ogata's staff poured concrete into southern bunkers instead. At Tinian Town, the broad sands stretched wide enough for tanks and artillery. There they built gun pits, dug trenches, aligned mortars to overlapping fields of fire. By July 1944, the southern defenses bristled with steel and confidence. "The North is secure by nature," Ogata told his superiors. "The South is where we shall defeat them." But war delights in breaking certainties. At dawn on July 24, 1944, Corporal Jack Morgan sat hunched in the driver's seat of his LVT-2. His helmet rattled with the vibration of the idling engine. The lagoon off the northern shore shimmered with smoke. To his left and right, dozens of other amphibious tractors rocked in swells, their bows pointed toward the thin line of White Beach 2. Behind him, 20 Marines crouched in the hold, faces pale in the dim light, rifles clutched like talismans. Morgan adjusted the levers with sweaty palms. He had read briefing notes the night before. The planners had chosen this beach precisely because the Japanese considered it impossible. The Seabees had promised to throw pontoon causeways onto the reef, bridging the narrow shelf. The tractors would do the rest, crawling where no boats could go. He whispered to himself, "Let's see if you're a monster today." The signal flare arced overhead. The Navy's bombardment began. Battleships and cruisers lined the horizon, their guns booming in rhythm. Rockets screamed from landing craft, pounding the northern cliffs. The earth shook even out at sea. A rolling curtain of fire marched toward the beach, kicking plumes of sand and smoke. "Go!" the radio barked. Engines roared in unison. The first wave of Amtraks surged forward, tracks churning water into froth. Morgan shoved throttle, his LVT lurching ahead. Spray whipped against his face. Around him, an armored tide crept toward land. On the cliffs above, Japanese observers shouted into field phones, "Enemy! Approaching north beaches! Not south, north!" Ogata snatched the receiver. "Nonsense! They cannot land there!" But through his binoculars he saw them, dark hulks moving steadily through surf, not stopping at the reef. His throat tightened. The reef that should have been a wall was nothing to them. Morgan felt the jolt as his tractor slammed onto coral. For a moment it rocked, scraping. He shoved the levers, teeth grinding. The tracks clawed, cleats biting stone. The engine screamed. Slowly, painfully, the Amtrak dragged itself forward, crawling over the reef's spine. Behind him he heard Marines cheer hoarsely inside the hold. One muttered, "She's climbing. She's really climbing." Then they were over. The bow dipped, splashing into shallows. Sand hissed under steel. Ahead the beach loomed, a narrow ribbon of tan, shadowed by cliffs still spitting smoke. Machine gun fire sparked from embrasures. Tracers hissed across the water. Morgan's gunner opened up with a .50, the rhythm pounding like a drumbeat, brass shells clattering onto the deck. "Ramp down!" The command cut through the roar. The LVT's jaw dropped, steel clanging against sand. Marines spilled out, running low, pressing themselves against the cliff face. One turned back and slapped the side of the hull. "Thanks for the ride, brother." Then he vanished into smoke. Morgan jerked the levers, reversing hard. The Amtrak lurched back into the surf, engine protesting. Another wave waited behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. Higgins' boats struggled near the reef, caught, their crews shouting. One vessel slewed sideways, machine gun fire tearing into its men, but the tractors pressed forward, each one carrying troops over coral and into the impossible beach. Up in his bunker, Ogata slammed the map table. His officers stared, faces pale. "They cannot," he muttered, but the word cracked. Reports flooded in, enemy armor ashore on White Beach 2, infantry massing inland, pontoon causeways unfolding behind them. The unthinkable had happened. His south-facing bunkers, his perfect defenses, were useless. The battle had already tilted in minutes. By midday, the narrow beaches crawled with Marines. Artillery was hauled ashore over floating causeways, dragged by tractors through surf. Tanks clanked over pontoons, rumbling inland. Engineers cut paths through cliffs, blowing gaps for supplies. The Japanese counterattacked desperately, charging from caves and pillboxes, but the beachhead was solid. The reef had failed them. The coral had betrayed them. Morgan lost track of how many runs he made that day. 3? 4? Each time he drove back into surf, his arms burned from the levers, his throat raw from fumes. Once shrapnel punched into the hull, showering sparks across the deck. Another time, a mortar exploded so close it lifted the tractor sideways, water flooding in, but the engine coughed back to life and he pressed on. In one trip, he carried wounded back. A Marine with half his leg gone clutched Morgan's boot as if to anchor himself to the living. The Amtrak rolled backward over coral, blood washing into bilge water. Morgan never forgot that weight, nor the man's whisper, "Don't stop, don't stop." By nightfall, more than 15,000 Marines had landed across the white beaches. Losses were light compared to Tarawa or Saipan. Historians later marveled the Americans had turned impossible ground into their doorway. They had chosen narrow, rocky beaches precisely because tractors could crawl where boats could not. The Japanese had guessed wrong, and in war, one wrong guess can kill an island. Ogata wrote in his diary before burning it, "We fortified where they would not go. They landed where we forbade ourselves to look. Monsters from the sea carried them, and the reef betrayed us." Morgan slept that night on sand blackened with smoke, his LVT parked beside him. The hull was dented, scarred, reeking of fuel, but alive. He patted the steel like the flank of a tired animal. "You ugly bastard," he whispered. "You did it again." Sometimes victory is not about storming the strongest gate. It is about walking through the door the enemy swears does not exist. And sometimes that door is carved by steel tracks crawling over coral in the night. The ramp slammed shut with a hollow clang, sealing us in. The inside of the LVT-4 stank of salt, oil, and blood. 20 minutes earlier, this same cargo hold had carried riflemen hunched against the steel, knuckles white around their weapons. Now it held wounded men, groaning under torn uniforms, clutching at makeshift bandages. The transformation was brutal, but natural. One trip in, we delivered life into fire. The next trip out, we carried life half-spent, fragile as glass. I was a corpsman, jammed between the litter racks, bolted to the hull. Every jolt sent a ripple of pain through the men stretched on canvas. One had a chest wound, bubbling red with each ragged breath. Another had his thigh tied off with a belt, the stump already blackening. A third just stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, lips whispering prayers I couldn't hear over the roar of the engine. The driver shouted back through the open hatch, "Hold tight! Reef coming up!" Then the whole machine lurched, the tracks grinding against coral, steel scraping stone. The wounded moaned as the litter frames rattled. One tried to sit up, blood streaking down his neck, but I pressed him flat again. "Don't move, almost there." We clawed over the reef, the same ridge that had stranded boats hours earlier. For the LVT, it was only another step. Behind us, smoke boiled from the beach, gunfire crackling like a storm. Ahead, the sea opened, a path back to the fleet. When we reached the transport area, sailors swarmed down rope nets to meet us. The ramp dropped, and stretcher teams rushed in, their arms practiced, voices urgent. The wounded were lifted, carried into waiting boats, and ferried to hospital ships looming offshore. The ramp slammed shut again, no rest. The driver spun the tracks, bow turning back toward the island. On the return, the cargo hold was no longer filled with bodies but with crates. Ammunition boxes stacked high, bandoliers of .30 caliber rounds coiled like snakes, water cans rattling. The hold smelled now of cordite and sweat, not blood. The same steel walls that had echoed with moans now shook with the clatter of shells. Marines waiting on the beach needed every bullet, every drop of water. The tractors became their lifeline. Hour after hour, the cycle continued. Men in, wounded out, supplies in, empty crates out. A machine born for landing turned into a shuttle, a bridge between sea and shore. Without them, the beach would have starved and bled dry. One trip stands in my memory sharper than all the rest. The ramp dropped on the sand, and Marines piled in, not living ones, but bodies wrapped in ponchos, stacked gently by their comrades. The driver's eyes met mine in the mirror, his face pale under soot. No words. He pulled the levers, and we carried them back across the reef, silent cargo bound for the sea. War demanded even that service from our monsters. The LVT-4's design made this role possible. Unlike the earlier models, its ramp was at the rear. Men and supplies flowed in and out without climbing the high sides. Wounded could be slid aboard on stretchers. Crates could be rolled straight into the belly. It turned the vehicle into more than an assault craft. It became an artery of the invasion. Historians later counted tonnage. At Iwo Jima alone, thousands of tons of ammunition, water, rations, and fuel were ferried ashore by LVTs. Hundreds of wounded were evacuated the same way. Ships offshore were useless without a system to bridge the surf. That bridge had tracks. For us inside, the numbers didn't matter. What mattered were faces. The Marine who gripped my wrist with a blood-soaked hand and whispered, "Tell my mom I walked ashore." The sailor who slapped my shoulder as we unloaded crates and said, "You boys keep the guns fed." The driver who muttered each night, "Another 12 trips, another day the line doesn't break." The Japanese never saw this side. From their bunkers, they only saw the first waves claw ashore, steel jaws opening to spill Marines into fire. They did not see the return trips, the endless shuttles, the machines turning into lifeboats and mules. Yet this was the true secret. The tractors were not just shock troops. They were the bloodstream. Without them, every beachhead would have drained dry. By Okinawa, the system was perfected. 1,000 LVTs surged in the first waves. By afternoon, they were already running the shuttle, hauling wounded back through surf so rough that boats capsized. At night they ran again, headlights covered, carrying water and ammo in silence. The rhythm was relentless. The machines never stopped until the battle ended or they broke down. I sometimes wondered if Donald Roebling had imagined this when he built his Hurricane rescue craft. In a way, his dream had come true. The Alligator saved lives, though not in the way he intended. It dragged them out of fire instead of flood. It ferried the broken instead of the stranded. By the war's end, Marines had a saying, "Without the Amtraks, we'd never have left the water." It was true in assault. But for us who ran the shuttle, another truth lived beside it. Without them, we'd never have brought our brothers back alive, or brought them home at all. Sometimes victory is not just the landing. It is the endless, thankless grind that keeps a beach supplied and keeps the wounded breathing. And sometimes the machine that looked like a monster was also the only lifeboat a man would ever know. The bunker walls sweated with salt. Corporal Matsuo pressed his eye to the firing slit, peering across the lagoon. Dawn light spilled over the reef like molten silver. For months he had listened to his officers repeat the same promise, "The coral will stop them." Boats could not cross. Men would be trapped in water. Rifles and machine guns would finish what the reef began. He believed it. Everyone did. On Tarawa, the guns had been sighted to sweep the shallows. On Saipan, every officer spoke of tides and depths, as if they were allies. On Tinian, Colonel Ogata had declared the northern beaches untouchable. The reef, the cliffs, the narrow strips of sand, nature itself was their fortress. But now, through the slit, Matsuo saw the horizon fill with shapes, Higgins boats, lines of them plowing forward. His breath steadied. This was expected. He fingered the trigger of his Nambu, waiting for the moment the boats would stall at the reef. At first, everything unfolded as promised. The flat-bottomed craft ground against coral, some slewing sideways, Marines spilling into chest-high water, gunfire cut them down in sprays. Matsuo exhaled with grim satisfaction. The reef had kept its word. Then he saw movement behind the boats, larger shapes, squat, ugly, crawling through the surf. At first he thought they were tanks, floating by miracle, but the tracks gave them away, steel cleats biting into water as if the sea itself were mud. The machines didn't stop at the reef. They climbed it. They clawed over it. Water frothed under their bellies, bows rising like the snouts of beasts. Matsuo froze. His commander shouted for heavier fire. Mortars thumped, shells splashing around the approaching monsters. But they came on, indifferent. Bullets sparked against their sides, ricocheted off steel. Then the jaws opened, ramps crashing down, and Marines poured directly onto the sand. In his diary, recovered after the battle, Matsuo wrote, "I had been told the sea was our ally, but today the sea delivered enemies on iron claws. They crawled from the water like creatures of a nightmare." He was not alone. Reports from Saipan noted unprecedented amphibious vehicles, advancing where no boats could. One Japanese lieutenant described them as armored crabs disgorging soldiers while still afloat. Another wrote bitterly, "We counted on coral and tide, both betrayed us." Colonel Ogata, in his underground command post on Tinian, received frantic calls. His south-facing guns thundered at empty horizons while the north was swarmed by tractors crawling ashore. He slammed the phone, shouting, "They were not supposed to be here. The reef was supposed to stop them." But shouting could not change the arithmetic. The shock spread beyond the battlefield. Intelligence officers filed after-action reports describing the machines in fearful tones. One wrote, "The enemy's amphibious tractors negate natural barriers. Beaches once thought secure are vulnerable. No lagoon, no reef can now be trusted." For villagers near the shore, the sight burned into memory. Fishermen hiding in huts saw iron beasts crawling past their nets. An old man later recalled, "They looked like ships that had learned to walk. The water was no barrier. They came straight at us." Even in Tokyo, whispers reached the general staff. Dispatches from the Marianas spoke of tracked amphibians delivering wave after wave. A naval officer reportedly said, "We built fortresses on sand. The Americans built machines that made the sand irrelevant." The machines were not invincible. Many were destroyed, burning hulks left smoking on beaches riddled with shells. But enough survived, enough crossed. And to defenders who had trusted in reef and tide, even a handful was betrayal. Matsuo's last entry, dated 2 days before he was killed, reads simply, "The monsters return each night. They carry the wounded away. Even in defeat, they do not stop. We cannot comprehend such machines." After the war, Japanese veterans spoke with a mixture of awe and bitterness. Some still could not believe a vehicle could swim and crawl with such stubbornness. Others admitted it had broken their faith in the homeland's natural defenses. One survivor of Tinian said in an interview decades later, "We waited for the reef to fight for us. Instead, it became their road." That was the psychological fracture. Not the tonnage landed, not the firepower. It was the collapse of belief that coral and sand could defend the empire. Once that belief cracked, no island felt safe again. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is not the shell that explodes, but the machine that erases the very ground you trusted. The war had its glamour machines, fighters slicing the sky, battleships thundering broadsides, tanks rolling with banners high. But in the ledgers of logistics, in the dusty files of supply officers, the numbers told another story. Numbers that spoke of monsters built not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. By 1945, American industry had produced over 18,000 amphibious tractors of every variant. Factories in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and beyond churned them out the way Detroit once stamped automobiles. Assembly lines hissed, welding sparks falling like showers as steel hulls took shape one after another. Each month, hundreds more rolled off, painted olive, their tracks waiting to bite both water and sand. Lieutenant Frank Dawson, a supply officer in the Pacific, lived in those numbers. His days were filled not with rifle fire, but with manifests, requisition orders, tallies of fuel and tonnage. Yet even he admitted, "Without the LVTs, all my paper meant nothing. Supplies don't matter if they rot on ships. You need claws to carry them ashore." He saw it first on Tarawa, ships offshore brimming with rations, ammunition, medical kits. But Higgins boats stranded on reefs, Marines dying for lack of cartridges. Then came the tractors, hauling crates straight onto sand under fire. Dawson watched from the transport deck, astonished. "I realized then," he said later, "that every bullet fired inland was delivered first by a set of steel tracks." The scale only grew. At Saipan, thousands of Marines rode in on LVTs. At Tinian, the tractors not only delivered the first waves, but hauled artillery over pontoon causeways, transforming a tiny coral shelf into a highway of war. At Leyte, they ferried men through typhoon surf, bridging the Philippines with steel. At Okinawa, Over 1,000 stormed the beaches in a single day, a tide of iron crabs clawing forward. But Dawson's strangest sight came far from the Pacific. In March 1945, he stood on the banks of the Rhine in Germany. Snow still crusted the fields. The war in Europe was ending, but the river loomed, a broad, cold barrier guarding the heart of Germany. He expected engineers with pontoons, perhaps ferries. Instead, he saw LVTs rolling off flat cars, their bows splashing straight into the gray current. Amphibious tractors in Europe, he muttered. But there they were, churning across the Rhine with infantry crouched inside, tracks scooping water as if it were just another reef. The same beasts that had clawed ashore at Tarawa now crawled through snowmelt under the gaze of ruined castles. Dawson later wrote, "It was as if the Pacific had followed us here. The machine didn't care what flag flew above the river, it only cared that there was water to cross." The numbers staggered even him. One LVT carried 20 men, or 2 tons of supplies. Multiply that by 18,000, and you had an army that could leapfrog oceans. In a single campaign, tractors moved more than 500,000 tons of material, from machine gun belts to sacks of rice. They became the bloodstream of the amphibious war. Yet the scale was not only material, it was psychological. To the Japanese defenders, every sighting of an LVT meant that no beach, however narrow, no reef, however jagged, was secure. To German civilians along the Rhine, watching iron crabs crawl from the river onto cobbled streets, it was proof that even rivers had betrayed them. Dawson, for all his obsession with ledgers, admitted a strange awe. He once walked among a motor pool of idle LVTs, dozens lined up in mud, engines quiet, tracks caked with salt. They looked to him like sleeping monsters, each scarred, each dented. "We built them by the thousands," he said softly, "but when you stand among them, you feel like one man in a herd of beasts." Some were troop carriers, open-topped, scarred with bullet strikes. Others were gun variants, turrets rusted but still menacing. All bore the smell of war, fuel, oil, salt water, and smoke. Dawson imagined the men each had carried, the terrified 19-year-old gripping his rifle, the bleeding sergeant clutching his chest, the engineer guarding crates of dynamite. 18,000 machines, millions of stories. By the end of the war, the LVT was no longer a novelty. It was the spine of amphibious doctrine, a workhorse as familiar as a rifle. Yet to Dawson, that familiarity never dulled the wonder. He remembered the first time he saw one climb over a reef at Tarawa. "That was the moment I understood," he wrote. "We had built a machine that erased geography. What nature said was impossible, it did without hesitation." Sometimes the measure of a weapon is not in the fire it spits, but in the distances it denies the enemy. For Japan, reefs and lagoons ceased to matter. For Germany, even the Rhine failed as a moat. For Dawson and every supply officer like him, the ledger was simple. Without those 18,000 monsters, the war would have lasted longer, costlier, bloodier. And when he closed his last manifest at war's end, Dawson allowed himself one rare, quiet thought. The tanks may win glory, the planes may win headlines, but the tractors won the ocean. The water at Tarawa had run red. For 3 days in November 1943, waves beat against the reef and returned, carrying the bodies of Marines. Survivors remembered the smell first, not cordite, not gasoline, but blood mixing with salt. It was the battle that seared itself into the Marine Corps like a brand. General Holland Smith, standing amid the wreckage after the fight, said it aloud. "Every mistake we could make we made here, and every lesson we paid for in blood." He meant many things: coordination, timing, the power of Japanese fortifications, but above all, he meant the reef. The planners had misread the tides. Higgins boats grounded hundreds of yards from shore, their hulls scraping coral. Marines splashed out, burdened with packs, waiting under machine gun fire. Entire platoons were cut down before they reached sand. The arithmetic was merciless, hundreds dead in minutes. But something else happened too. LVTs, few in number then, fewer than 200, crawled over the reef and clawed straight to the beach. Those who rode inside reached sand alive. Those who waited beside stranded boats often never rose again. Corporal John Spillane, who survived Tarawa, recalled, "I saw men in front of me cut apart, saw boats burning on the reef. Then an Amtrak came grinding past, Marines crouched inside, and it went straight in. I thought it looked like salvation and damnation at once." The Corps took note. After Tarawa, the lesson was clear. Never again would Marines storm a reef or lagoon without enough amphibious tractors. What had been a curiosity became doctrine. Factories doubled orders. Training shifted. By Saipan, by Tinian, by Peleliu, by Okinawa, there were thousands. At staff briefings, officers spoke of Tarawa in cold mathematics. A landing craft carried 30 men. If it grounded at the reef, maybe 10 survived. An LVT carried 20. If it crossed, maybe 15 lived to fight. The equation was simple. Survival demanded tracks. But to the men who had been there, it was not numbers. It was memories. Sergeant Bill Richardson remembered dragging himself through waist-deep water, bullets snapping past, until an LVT roared by, its tracks throwing spray. "I grabbed the side and held on," he said years later. "The driver pulled me aboard, and I collapsed between ammo crates. That ugly beast saved me." The Japanese drew lessons too, though differently. A captured diary from a defender on Betio read, "Our commanders promised the reef would kill them, but the machines walked across. We shot at them, but bullets sparked and they did not die. The sea is no wall." Another officer wrote in his report, "If these vehicles multiply, no island is safe." They were right. The monsters multiplied. By mid-1944, they rolled into every major landing. Some carried guns, some carried supplies, all carried fear. Historians often debate Tarawa's worth. Was it necessary to seize a tiny atoll at such a cost? Over 1,000 Marines killed for 2 square miles of coral and sand. But even the critics admit Tarawa forced change. Without that brutal lesson, later battles might have drowned in blood as well. The price was not abstract. Families received telegrams. Mothers in Kansas and Ohio buried sons who had fallen in a lagoon half a world away. Veterans returned haunted. Spillane admitted, "Every night for years I heard the surf and the screams. Tarawa never left me." Yet, when asked if it mattered, he would answer quietly, "We learned there. Others lived because we learned." By Okinawa, the difference was stark. Thousands of tractors surged ashore, delivering wave after wave. The reef no longer mattered. The Corps had paid its tuition at Tarawa, and the rest of the Pacific campaign collected the dividends. In Tokyo, intelligence officers reported grimly, "The enemy's amphibious tractors render natural defenses obsolete. Our islands cannot rely on reefs or lagoons. Every shore is vulnerable." But by the time those reports circulated, it was too late. The monsters had become doctrine. In the end, Tarawa was both a tragedy and a genesis. Tragedy for the men who died choking in salt water, genesis for the machine that changed amphibious war. A machine born as a rescue craft, twisted into a weapon, baptized in blood at Tarawa, and perfected on the march to Japan. General Holland Smith's words lingered long after the war. "We paid in blood," he had said. The reef had collected its toll, but from that toll rose the conviction that never again would Marines charge through water without steel at their side. Sometimes victory demands a down payment in horror. Tarawa was that payment. And the interest was collected every time a tractor clawed over coral and dropped its ramp on enemy sand.